thankful we're all here. Thankful we get to enjoy the growing pains together. The growing pains of new equipment and still waiting on some equipment to be hooked up and all of that. And so along the lines of what I said Wednesday night, we appreciate your patience and your consideration as we move through this process. And Lord willing, things will just keep getting better and better. And hopefully I didn't just jinx us even for this evening. But I'm thankful you're here. Thankful we have this time to really to pick up something we started a while back and revisit or continue a series of thoughts about a certain king. What is it we say? Those who don't learn from history are what? Are doomed to repeat it. I had someone come out this morning after the sermon and ask me, okay, what kind of brownie do you shoot? And I gave them this, I'm sure, quite puzzled look. And in my brain, I'm going to a totally different direction. And I'm thinking about maybe that's a nickname that I'm not aware of for brownie. You know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? Well, it's an old Kodak camera that was known as the brownie. And so I had no idea, even though I preached about Kodak this morning. Okay, so I aged myself post-sermon, I guess. But then they made a comment that we need to learn. Well, they said we need to know and learn from history, even though we don't often like to do that, and maybe even just take the effort and the time to see what's there in the past that we can learn from. And that's a lot of what we're doing also this evening, is looking back at a character in history. We're looking at, if you're filling out the handout, I should probably start pushing some buttons, all right? But if you're looking at the handout, we're returning this evening to our consideration of King Saul. King Saul. About a month ago, we looked at his early life as recorded in 1 Samuel, and a mixture of some good and some bad. We said he's one of those characters in Scripture that mostly we need to learn what not to do from King Saul. But we did point out a couple of positives about Saul, really at the beginning of his mark on Scripture, his introduction to us in the pages of God's holy word. And so, as just a recap of that, I'm not really going to go back into that other than here are the 4 lessons that we looked at from the life of Saul a while back, and then we're going to add 4 more for this evening. So some of you are trying to remember, how long did Gantt preach when he had 4 lessons about Saul the first time? Now how many is he going to have? He has 4, all right? But we looked at his humble beginnings and how he started as very humble, at least as far as we can tell in Scripture. If anything, he is maybe even at one point goes to the extreme when he lowers his view of self and presents himself so lowly. And then he makes some brave initial moves or first steps. I can see, look now. He steps out and he runs into battle to defend the people of Israel. He shows bravery as not just the king, but as the king is willing to lead troops into battle, or a warrior king, as it were. But then we noted the beginning of the end, the turning point. When his impatience gets the best of him, he's unwilling to wait, and that leads to trouble. And then we, in a sense, fast-forwarded last time to say, even though he started well, he didn't end well. His life ends tragically after a series of really a downward cycle of bad decisions and rebellion against God. And as the reader, you tend to get frustrated, I think, with Saul as it's wake up and see what you're doing. And he never seems to wake up and even realize what he's doing as he continues to follow that downward path. And so we saw the idea, the principle really then. Yes, it's important to start something, but if you don't stick with it and stay through, then what do you have in the end? Well, now for this evening, and I began to put this together, and so I'm going to be pretty, I guess, cheesy tonight, because they don't just all start with the same letter. You've got I-N, I-M, I-N, and I-N, okay? And that's just how it nicely worked out. I did have to change the chronology just a bit. Mostly, we're still going through his life as it is in the text in 1 Samuel or in that chronological order. But at least for the second one, we're going to fast forward a little bit through that. But let's look together at these 4 other lessons. Now, once more, I lean toward looking at this from the standpoint of leadership, because he was the leader of God's people at the time. And so you can make applications to today, leadership in the church, elders, and others that may have roles of influence and leadership. Or you can look at it in other places in life, possibly, where you have a position to lead or to have an impact in the lives of other people. But we see Saul's incomplete obedience. His submission is not complete to God. And then we see the impact in his life of those that he sought guidance from. Simply the impact of guidance. And then a really big one that could be in the running for taking the top award for the biggest problem in Saul's life and Saul's heart is the intensive pride that eventually develops on the scene of his life and his reign. And then we'll end by what I think you could put right in there as another runner-up for sure, as a big one, or the big one, is his impenitence, his lack of penitence. Let's begin in 1 Samuel chapter 15 this evening with Saul's incomplete obedience. 1 Samuel chapter 15. We're going to read a few verses and kind of summarize along the way and think about his lack of total obedience. Go clean your room. A few hours later, it's been in the room, and the parent comes in, and I'm going to go so far as to say 3/4, if you have to try and fraction it out, of the room is clean. What does that mean? What's not clean? Well, I'm not a math guy, remember? I think you got a quarter left over. Why didn't you clean your room? I did clean my room. You cleaned part of your room. I cleaned most of my room. Why didn't you clean the rest of it? Well, you see, I got distracted. I started playing with a toy. You see where this goes? And of course, that's a bit of a silly example, and I'm not saying it's totally silly. Okay, there might be something there for parenting, but in a much bigger way, what does see Saul doing? He obeys, but not totally. And so you can take that line, incomplete obedience, and you almost want to mark a line, well, we do that, on your handout, through the word obedience. Or circle it and put out beside it something along the lines of the idea that really, incomplete obedience is not obedience at all. Now, does that mean that if we don't perfectly obey everything God says, then God's going to say, okay, I'm rejecting you because you rejected me? Well, no. But there is a concept here of how I see God, how I see His commands. Do I see His commands as something as suggestions, or as that maybe some of them I'm good with because I already like that, or I'm going to do that anyway? And some of us would do some good things if we didn't know that's what God wanted. What happens when there's something we want to do, or something we don't want to do, God tells us to do? Someone compared it to, it might be, you might put it in a context, say where you're in a company, you're on a team, and you're great at encouraging your people, but you slander your rivals. Or you do great at work, and you have a great work ethic, but then you come home, and you're horrible to your family. Now those are extreme examples of this idea of obeying God, but only in parts, and almost picking and choosing what we decide. Let's look at it. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, in the opening of the passage, Samuel gives the message from God to King Saul that when they go up against the Amalekites, they're not to spare anyone. You totally annihilate them. Don't spare anyone. That's the very clear-cut message. And there's nothing fuzzy or foggy about it. It is as clear as it can be. You don't spare anyone. The animals, the people, nothing. Don't spare the king. And then as you begin to read, they go up against the Amalekites and they defeat them. They almost do that. Look with me about verses 8 and 9, about halfway through this second paragraph of 1 Samuel chapter 15. It says this, that he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, he being Saul, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people, it does already mention that, the people are a part of this, It wasn't as if Saul was just calling all the shots and they're just obeying. They're connected here. It says he spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatted calves and the lambs and all that was good, would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, on the other hand, they devoted to destruction. And then Samuel shows up. And what's the first thing Saul says? It's in that next paragraph. He greets Samuel by saying, I've done what God commanded. And it's one of those classic scenes. You don't know if you should start crying already or just laughing or both. But Samuel goes, what's that I hear? That sounds like animals. Sounds like the sheep. And then he has to explain. The people. We spared some of the best. The people wanted to make sacrifices. You could add in here to the thinking of the old end justifies the means. Well, I did it because I didn't do everything God says, but I had good reason. I had a good goal. I was trying to worship God. I never hear that kind of thinking today. And so Samuel asked him why. Pick up with me in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 17. And I don't know for sure. And part of this is because of the nature of the Hebrew to the English, but it's at least possible that Samuel appealed to some of the words that Saul used when he first approached him about being king. You remember that in the humble beginnings, back in chapters 11 and 12, when Saul says, I'm the least of the least? Why then would you think I would be up for this? Look at the questions he asked him. He says in verse 17, though you are little in your own eyes, and are not head of the tribe of Israel. Sure sounds like he's going back to that conversation they had a few years previously. The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission. And he says, he told you what to do. Why then, verse 19? And it's that same kind of why question Saul had asked him. Why then are you picking me? Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of God? And Saul protests. And when he tries to once more excuse it away and to say he obeyed, then you get what seems to be the quotable part we see most quoted in this section. So it might be the part some of us remember more than the rest of the story. It's where it turns into poetry, verse 22. As the Lord has great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination. You might think witchcraft and black magic and paganistic ways of getting what you want. And presumption, where I take it upon myself. I'm suggesting this evening, as you read through this and you start analyzing how this works in our hearts, a lot of it goes back to our view of God, how high or not so high our view of God is. He says that is as iniquity and idolatry. So because you've rejected the word of the Lord, He has also rejected you from being king. And then if you want some fun, kind of edging on the PG-13 side of things, skip a paragraph and read what Samuel does when he takes care of the problem and what he does to King Agag. As I read through this, I think about the proverb writer. How Solomon will later write about kings and about this idea of complete submission to God. So hold your finger in 1 Samuel. Flip over for just a moment with me to Proverbs chapter 21. Proverbs chapter 21. Let's read the first 4 verses. Mainly looking at verse 3. But look at some of the context here. I know sometimes we don't know. Proverbs is a little different. It's difficult sometimes to read it in context. But I at least see there are times where some of the Proverbs that are listed, they're put together with some context at least. This one says this, Proverbs 21, it says, the king's heart is a stream of water, in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts. And then verse 3, to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. And then verse 4, that points to some of our later thoughts, but already makes sense here, that haughty eyes and a proud heart, the lamp of the wicked, are sin. I think of the way that, at least based on his appeals, part of why Saul does this is by trying to please people. But he also seems to look at this situation through a worldly outlook or a viewpoint that it looks at, well, here's the king, he's an enemy king. Think about how we can use this if we take him prisoner, and look at the goods we have. Remember, it said they didn't take the stuff that wasn't worth anything. They looked at the nice animals, and whether they were actually planning to sacrifice them or not is kind of beside the point, isn't it? But they looked at it from that materialistic standpoint. As I began to think about leading and working with the church today, never possible that we make decisions based on purely on numbers, or we base decisions and make compromises on doctrine or practices, possibly in worship, because of what will please people. If they want this, why not? And Saul gives us first this evening an example of the dangers and how God sees it when our obedience to his will is not complete or incomplete obedience. Now here's the second one of the evening, and that is the impact of guidance. This is where you begin to reflect on all the different influences in your life. You begin to ask, where is it that I go to when I need advice, or I need counsel, I need some decision-making wisdom? Do I appeal to something in pop culture? Do I go to my friends? Do I go to an old mentor? What do I do? Do I just turn on the TV and see if there's some soap opera that might answer my life problems, or if there's a talk show? Where do we go? I'm not here tonight to try and say you shouldn't listen to talk radio or read books or psychology or whatever, but to be careful about the sources in our lives. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 28. 1 Samuel chapter 28. And I think I'll go ahead and get all of these. They can kind of flow, hopefully, pretty well. But in 1 Samuel, several years later, there's a lot of water in the bridge between Saul and David, and we'll come back around to that in just a moment. But Saul's in trouble again. The enemies are encamped against him. He's looking for help, and so he begins to inquire of the Lord, and he doesn't get anything. There's not a prophet, there's not a dream, nothing to help him out. And the writer makes it clear, reminds us that Saul's the guy that helped to remove people that were trying to get information apart from God from the land. He had run all the warlocks and witches, and I guess if Harry Potter was there, he'd been run out of town, okay? He got rid of all that. But he goes and looks for one now himself. He sends for a witch. And he has his servants go, and they're not here anymore. Well, they find one in the land of Endor. And we went from Harry Potter. This kind of sounds like a planet in Star Wars, okay? But they find he takes two servants. He disguises himself to this witch. And she ruses up pretty quickly. She may be a witch, but she's not unintelligent, I guess we would say. And she figures it out, especially when she says, what do you want? And he says, I need you to call up Samuel. Now think about this. Track his life. He went from Samuel being the trusted advisor and the one that he went to, and the one that would come to him with messages from God and instructions, and here's what you do, and here's how you go into battle. And eventually, in a sense, Samuel leaves him because God says he's not going to be king anymore. I'm backing away. In another sense, Saul leaves Samuel behind and does it his own way. And now it's gone from Samuel to no Samuel now. He's trying to bring Samuel back from the grave so he can talk to him now. That's how desperate he is. But It's a lesson in what sources we're willing to go to and apart from God and His Word. The King Saul would go and find. He looks and he finds, and then I call it falling, because if you look at verse 20 of 1 Samuel chapter 28, that paragraph is where he doesn't eat, just kind of becomes beside himself, becomes a shell of himself, as we would say. And then finally, along with his servants and the woman, he's able to eat and somewhat be restored back to himself. But it all starts with his seeking a message and content from somewhere else. And once more, the proverb writer has some wisdom for us this evening. In Proverbs chapter 15, verse 22, we're warned not here of the danger of going to a witch or a necromancer, but the danger actually of having too many counselors, but also of not having a plan, not having a source of solid wisdom. It's kind of two halves there. I'm just going to do it my own way and I'll figure it out, or listening to so many voices. We might struggle with those today. I don't need anybody. I'm not going to take advice from them. I don't care if they're older, they've been there, or we just kind of listen to everything and figure it out from the mixture of voices, different streams of content that we have. And you can take that in a more literal way and think about the benefits and advantages of our world. We've got so many podcasts and YouTube channels, and there's so many ways to access, whether it's working on your grill or it is something in spiritual nature. I sometimes wonder if we're not careful. We aren't being as careful as we should be about what sources am I really listening to, which ones am I paying attention to. Maybe I have so many that I don't even know which one is right with God. Saul, we see the impact with Saul of guidance, the sources we have, the company that we keep. We can keep this going and just extend the applications to the friends that we have, the associations that we have. Not that you can't be friends with someone who's unwise, they might need your wisdom. And once again, we don't want to take any of these to an extreme. But to point out tonight that where Saul ran off course. You ask, how did a man chosen by God to lead God's people fall so far? Part of it is where he began to go for information and content. The impact of guidance. And then the third one this evening, we see his incomplete obedience, the impact of guidance, and now we see the intensive jealousy. I'm going to overlap this one in my mind with pride. I tend to think it was his pride that allowed or opened the door for the jealousy to grow in his heart. And you could, like I said at the beginning, you could point to this one as a big overall problem for Saul. And yes, he had lost the kingship as far as God's concerned by chapter 15 and his incomplete or his disobedience, really. But I don't think, and this is just Gantt looking at it, I don't think things were going to be as bad for the rest of his life and for sure the end of his life, if not for this next lengthy part between him and David. But you see David and his success in 1 Samuel chapter 18. It's right after the David and Goliath scene. You remember Saul is helping David. He tries to help. Most of his help isn't what David needs. And then David keeps being successful. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 18. Let's read a few verses together of this section about David and his success. Verse 5 of 1 Samuel chapter 18 is when David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. So that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servant. Note it doesn't say anything about Saul and what he thought, even at this point. Now later, once he becomes jealous, he's going to start sending David out more. Think about that. What does David do later when he needs to get rid of somebody? He doesn't just send him out in the battle. He does make it a bit more direct. You put him on the front line and you draw back. Can I say y'all draw back? I think I can say that. I almost wonder that David isn't repeating part of what Saul did to him. But he's trying to get rid of David because of David's success. And you keep reading about that. In verse 6, as they're coming home and David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing. Can you imagine that? I mean, it's not just the servants or the palace musicians. It's describing as a whole area is celebrating David's victories in battle. And that's when you get their song. Verse 7, Saul has struck down his thousands. I thought Saul was pretty great, but David is 10,000. And so verse 8 says that Saul was very angry, and this displeased him. And he then says, they've subscribed to David 10,000, to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? And look at verse 9. What does Saul do? He puts his eye on David. Gotta love that. He eyes him from that day forward. And so the rest of Saul's life, other than a few brief moments, per what's in Scripture, is ongoing conflict between Saul and David. And most of it is where Saul is trying to get rid of David. He tries to kill him personally. He tries to get Jonathan to kill David. He of course, eventually sends out some, what we would call probably posses after David. To no avail. And Saul knows that God is with David. You see that? In his fearful awe, the text says, you look down to verses 12 and 13, and then verse 16, after he's afraid of David because he knows the Lord's with him. You would think that'd be a good time to stop trying to kill him, right? But in verse 16, it says, when he saw his success in all his undertakings, he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. And all of Israel and Judah especially loved him. They're still eating it up. And then that just eats up Saul that much more. So when you look at those last couple of verses there, I attached them. Hope that doesn't throw you too much, 29 and 30 there, or 30 and 29, but you see at the end of this chapter almost a summary of David being Saul's enemy, or really David being Saul's enemy from here on out. And David just keeps being successful after success. Success after success. And this jealousy between the two, it reminds us of times when we see anyone who is successful in a context related to us as a threat. Or anyone that doesn't agree or isn't totally supportive of us, we think they're totally against us. And we look at them as a threat to our, it might be our leadership, our influence circle, our power. What's the old saying? The power corrupts, and absolute power, what? Absolutely corrupts. Could it be that his power and then the threat to that, and he knows God's already going to make David king, goes to his head or goes to his heart? So you might think about what the proverb writer says in Proverbs 14, verse 30, about jealousy and how it destroys us. That's what happens to Saul. And so I think about competing. I put a lighthouse up there because one of my favorite sayings among thinking about members of the church, and among elders, and among preachers, is that there are no competing lighthouses. But elders never get jealous of other elders. Preachers never get jealous of other preachers. Please don't shake or nod on any of these questions, okay? Church members don't get jealous of other members. And it might be in a spiritual setting, that it might be that maybe they know more or they're involved in more. It might be other things. It might just be they have a nicer house and a nicer car. You know, of course, it may all belong to the bank. You don't know that. But we get into competition. And then what happens? Just like Saul and David, then it becomes resentment. We start competing. We start resenting other people. Because it might simply be that they've been successful, haven't done anything to us. They don't even probably know we're thinking so much about them. They might even be thinking about you, right? Me. It's the problem of our pride and our view of self and others that leads us down a road of this pride and envy toward other people. It becomes the downfall of King Saul. Now, here's one more for the evening. And I said this one was in the running too. It's his impenitence. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 15 for a moment and consider the way he confesses. I'm using that loosely. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now keep in mind that there are times later when David has Saul to rights. And Saul does something similar. He will plead that he'll try to say, oh, I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be trying to kill you. I'm paraphrasing. Let's be friends again. And then once he's free from harm, he's right back at it. I think that mindset starts right here. The first time God says, I'm rejecting you because you rejected my word. Verse 24 is when Saul says, I have sinned. Sounds an awful lot like, I'll go ahead and get the next slide there. Sounds an awful lot like what David says. When Nathan says, David, you are the man. David says, I've sinned before the Lord. Saul says, I have sinned. I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord. He finally admits that, and your words, but then you have to go and say, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now, therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me. I may bow down before the Lord. So Samuel says, I'm not going to do it. And before the scene's over, it kind of becomes pitiful because Saul he's trying to hold on to Samuel. Don't leave me. But there is never a single indication that any of the penitent words here, he's already making excuses in my mind, but if any of this changes anything here on earth. That's the difference. I said not to compete, but we're going to compare. Because in some ways, David does stuff that we would think, at least, is worse. David's the guy that, as king, brings Bathsheba to his quarters, conceives a child by her, and then to cover it up, he gets her husband drunk, and then he has his, as we mentioned earlier, he has her husband murdered. And still covering it up until the prophet shows up and tells the story. We reference also a moment ago with Nathan. What's the difference? Because God says David's a man after my own heart. He said that all the way back in 2 Samuel, or back in 1 Samuel. And then Paul repeats it in Acts chapter 13. I think it's that David really was broken by this. I mean, David goes on to write 2 Psalms because of it. Psalm 51, I think he writes soon after Nathan leaves. Psalm 32, I think maybe months or years later as he thinks back on what happened and his forgiveness. It's a message about impenitent hearts. That he's unwilling to confess. Instead he conceals in a way his transgression. And that's Proverbs 23, verse 18. He's not willing to take responsibility, and his repentance is not carried through or followed through. There's something there for us about what happens when we begin to make decisions like Saul. I would imagine just about everybody in this room has made decisions along the line. I'm not saying anybody's done all that Saul did. But similar in principle. So let's wrap this up for the year. We've seen these 4 additional lessons, and they are all unfortunately negative about Saul. His incomplete obedience. He doesn't really obey God because he picks and chooses what he does for God. We saw the impact of guidance or the wrong kind of guidance in his life. What are my sources? What am I listening to? What am I following? And we saw that intensive jealousy between him and David. Now, I'm not saying that David has a clean slate even in this time period. But for sure, from Saul's standpoint, the jealousy is the best thing might be the same for us. And then what if, in all of this, he had simply been truly penitent, had truly had his heart broken by his own sin, and been aware. But it strikes me that throughout his entire life, at least past that pivot point, it's like Saul thinks he's always right, and is never realizes, never has the awareness that, oh, maybe I've really messed up, and I need to turn things around. And so I leave you with this evening as we think about Saul and us and learning from Saul. be aware of this. How do you fight back against this kind of attitude of pride and presumption against God and other people? You've got to find ways to wake yourself up and be aware. You've got to have the self-honesty and that willingness to look at yourself, self-examine, be aware of the problems that may begin to develop in my own heart, and be willing to make a change. The way I've been living doesn't have to continue. And I almost wonder if that's where Saul gets caught up. I'm not trying to excuse him. I'm saying that I think part of it too is he begins this pattern of disobedience and doing it in his own way. And he just sticks to that. But people can change. We hear that sometimes, right? People can't change. People can change. Think about the old Jimmy Stewart Western. There's a difference between men and apples. Just because you're in a barrel of rotten apples doesn't mean you can't be changed. You got to be willing to do that. To accept that my behavior may need to change. Especially when I've sinned. I'm supposed to be penitent about it. And here's the third one. We said the problem was pride, jealousy, impenitence. The response, the key for all of these. I think we're up to 6 negatives for Saul. I'm going to say all 6, at least all 4 tonight, and I'm borrowing from last time. All of the problems in Saul's life would have been solved or resolved if he had trusted God. If he had pursued closeness or intimacy with his God. Because Saul's story ends in the tragedy of taking his own life in battle of all things with the Philistines at the end of the book. But our story doesn't have to end anything like Saul's story. But Saul wasn't that he really he was a weak king. It wasn't that he had necessarily personality deficiencies, and eventually there's some things to develop, and you have references to a spirit that takes him, and the Lord the Spirit leaves him, but as a whole, it's not that kind of problem. He failed as a human before God. He failed as a king and a leader of God's people because he did not, or better even, he stopped trusting in God. So as we invite each other this evening to live before and for our Lord, as we invite each other this week and encourage each other to live in one way that models not someone like King Saul, but someone like King Jesus or King Jesus himself. Maybe you're reminded, one, of just what can happen when we don't. But what if, how different things could have been, even between Saul and David, if Saul had sought God. Let's stand and sing together.